No soap, no deodorant, not a single shower in his entire life. Sleeping in the same animal hide clothing for weeks at a time, working, sweating, sitting around smoke-filled fires every single evening. If you had to guess, right now, how an average person living 40,000 years ago actually smelled, the obvious answer feels pretty obvious. Picture it for a second, in as much detail as you can. No running water anywhere nearby, not the kind you can turn on with a tap. No concept of laundry, no concept of a change of clothes waiting clean in a drawer. Whatever animal hide or woven fiber someone was wearing that day was probably the same thing they'd been wearing for a considerable stretch of time already, through physical labor, through weather, through every ordinary and unglamorous moment of daily survival. By any modern measure, the conditions sound like exactly the recipe for the worst body odor imaginable.
For how many days before you smell bad without showering? Comment your funny experiences below.
So the obvious assumption is that ancient humans smelled absolutely horrific, at least by modern standards. No products, no plumbing, no concept of daily hygiene the way we understand it. And that assumption isn't unreasonable. It's just very likely wrong, or at least far less straightforward than it sounds. But here's the thing archaeologists and anthropologists keep running into whenever this question actually gets studied properly. Bad smell isn't an objective fact sitting inside a person. It's a comparison. And the moment you actually think through what ancient humans were being compared to, the whole question starts to look completely different. Think about it from the other direction for a second. If you'd never once in your life encountered soap, running water, or the concept of a shower, you wouldn't experience your own smell as unpleasant, because unpleasant only means anything relative to some alternative you know exists. A fish doesn't notice water. A person who has never smelled clean doesn't notice dirty. Not in the judgmental, self-conscious way modern humans do when they catch a whiff of themselves after skipping a shower. Everyone around him smelled roughly the same way. Nobody in that entire community had ever encountered soap, showers, or antiperspirant, which means there was no contrast to notice in the first place. A modern person walking into that camp would absolutely notice something, but the people who actually lived there had nothing to compare themselves against, no baseline of clean to measure their own smell against and come up short. The entire concept of smelling bad only really makes sense relative to some alternative that smells better, and for tens of thousands of years, that alternative simply didn't exist yet. And there's real evidence they were actively grooming themselves anyway, not because they were chasing some abstract idea of hygiene, but because grooming, in one form or another, appears to be a deeply old human behavior. Archaeological sites have turned up traces of red ochre used cosmetically on skin, dating back tens of thousands of years, alongside evidence of careful personal adornment, shell beads, deliberate hairstyling implied by preserved combs and pins at later sites, and consistent, repeated attention paid to appearance in ways that go well beyond pure survival necessity. None of that behavior was primarily about odor control, at least not as far as researchers can tell. Much of it likely carried social or symbolic meaning, status, group identity, ritual significance. But the underlying instinct, spending real time and effort managing how your body looks and presents itself to the people around you, is exactly the same instinct that eventually produces soap, cologne, and skincare routines. Ancient humans weren't indifferent to how they came across. They just expressed that instinct through completely different tools than the ones available today. There's a reasonable case to be made that grooming, in some form, is simply part of what it means to live in a social group at all, regardless of era. Primates more broadly spend an enormous amount of time grooming each other, not purely for cleanliness, but because the act itself reinforces social bonds, and there's no obvious reason to think early humans would have been any different. The specific tools changed constantly: ochre, oils, resins, eventually soap and modern cosmetics, but the underlying social function grooming seems to serve may have stayed remarkably consistent the entire time. Which raises the real question this video is actually about. If they weren't washing with soap, but they clearly cared about how they presented themselves, what were they actually doing instead? Human sweat itself isn't naturally that odorous on its own. Fresh sweat is mostly water and salt, and by itself, it's nearly odorless. The smell most people associate with body odor comes specifically from bacteria on the skin, breaking down compounds in sweat from a particular type of gland called apocrine glands, concentrated in areas like the armpits. Those bacteria have always been there, on every human body throughout our entire evolutionary history. What's changed dramatically isn't the biology, it's everything surrounding it: diet, environment, clothing, and modern hygiene products, all of which interact with that same basic bacterial process in wildly different ways depending on the era. There's actually a case to be made that body odor served a real evolutionary function long before anyone thought to try masking it. Apocrine glands, the ones specifically responsible for the compounds bacteria turn into what we recognize as body odor, are concentrated in areas associated with sexual maturity and mate selection across many mammal species, humans included. Researchers studying human scent and attraction have found evidence that individual body odor carries detectable information about genetic compatibility, immune system differences, and even hormonal state, information that, at least in theory, would have been genuinely useful to ancient humans making decisions about who to pair with, long before language existed to have that conversation directly. Modern humans spend enormous effort masking exactly the signal our own biology spent millions of years evolving to send. Researchers who've studied modern hunter-gatherer groups directly, people whose lifestyles offer the closest living approximation we have to deep prehistory, found something genuinely telling. Groups like the Hadza in Tanzania, who don't use soap, deodorant, or modern hygiene products in anything close to a Western sense, are consistently described by researchers working closely with them as not smelling nearly as strong as Western assumptions would predict, particularly compared to the body odor commonly associated with a typical unwashed Western body relying entirely on deodorant to mask it. This isn't a fringe observation from a single anthropologist with a strong opinion. It shows up repeatedly across multiple field studies involving different hunter-gatherer populations in different parts of the world, from the Kalahari to the Amazon. Researchers spending extended time living alongside groups with no access to modern hygiene products and consistently reporting that body odor simply wasn't the overwhelming issue Western intuition predicts it should be. Something else was clearly doing a lot of the work that soap gets credit for in modern life. It also matters that humans don't have just one kind of sweat gland doing all the work. Eccrine glands, spread across almost the entire body, produce the thin, mostly odorless sweat responsible for cooling the body down, a system humans rely on far more heavily than most other mammals, which is part of what made long-distance persistence hunting in hot climates possible in the first place. Apocrine glands, concentrated in specific areas, are the ones responsible for the thicker, protein-rich secretions bacteria actually convert into noticeable odor. Ancient humans, working and moving constantly outdoors, were almost certainly sweating heavily and often through the eccrine system, without that sweat itself being the primary source of the smell modern people associate with an unwashed body. Diet turned out to matter enormously in explaining why. Modern Western diets, heavy in processed sugar, red meat, dairy, and alcohol, are strongly linked in multiple studies to more pungent, more noticeable body odor, largely because of how those specific foods get metabolized and expelled through sweat. Hunter-gatherer diets, built around lean wild game, foraged plants, nuts, and tubers, without processed sugar or heavily saturated fats, appear to produce measurably less offensive body odor as a fairly direct metabolic consequence, independent of how often anyone actually bathes. One particularly well-documented study on this exact question compared body odor ratings tied to different diets and found that people eating diets higher in fruit and vegetables and lower in meat and processed carbohydrates were consistently rated as smelling more pleasant by independent observers based purely on sweat samples with no information about who ate what. If diet alone can shift how sweat smells that dramatically among modern people eating modern food, the effect on someone eating an entirely unprocessed, hunter-gatherer diet for their entire life, starting from birth, would plausibly be significantly more pronounced. Here's the part that flips the whole question around. Modern hygiene habits, especially heavy use of antibacterial soap and antiperspirant, don't just remove odor. They disrupt the skin's natural bacterial ecosystem, the specific mix of bacteria that had coexisted with human skin for our entire evolutionary history, often replacing a relatively stable, balanced bacterial community with a disrupted one that, when hygiene routines lapse even briefly, can actually produce stronger, less pleasant odor than an undisturbed, naturally balanced microbiome ever would on its own. This creates a strange kind of trap that ancient humans never had to deal with. In a strange way, modern hygiene habits may have created the very problem they're marketed as solving, an escalating arms race between products and the bacteria those same products keep provoking. It's also worth noting that smelling bad isn't even a consistent standard across modern cultures, let alone across all of human history. What counts as an acceptable level of natural body odor varies enormously between countries today, with some cultures far more tolerant of natural scent than others, and deodorant use rates that differ dramatically as a result, not because of any underlying biological difference between populations, but because of differing cultural expectations around what a body is supposed to smell like. If the standard for smelling bad shifts this much between neighboring modern countries with access to the exact same products, it's worth being genuinely skeptical of any confident claim about how a person from 40,000 years ago would have smelled by comparison. Skin bacteria, it turns out, isn't the enemy soap treats it as. Dermatologists studying the skin microbiome have increasingly found that a healthy, stable bacterial community actually helps regulate odor, moisture, and even skin health generally, rather than simply causing problems that need to be scrubbed away entirely. Modern humans, in a strange way, may have spent the last century aggressively disrupting a system that ancient humans, without ever knowing any of this, left largely intact simply by not having the tools to interfere with it. Ancient humans weren't leaving grooming entirely to chance either. Evidence across multiple prehistoric sites points to deliberate use of aromatic plants, tree resins, and specific oils applied to skin and hair for reasons that plausibly included scent management alongside symbolic or medicinal purposes. Some of the earliest evidence for intentional plant-based scent use dates back tens of thousands of years, well before anything resembling written history, suggesting that even without soap, humans were still actively managing how they smelled, using whatever the environment around them happened to provide. Later archaeological and historical evidence only strengthens the case that this was a consistent, deliberate human behavior, rather than an occasional accident. Residue analysis on ancient containers has identified traces of aromatic plant oils used cosmetically long before formal written recipes for perfume existed anywhere. The impulse to smell a certain way, and to actively do something about it using whatever materials were on hand, appears to run just as deep in the archaeological record as the impulse to look a certain way. The pattern continues well past prehistory too, which is worth mentioning because it shows this wasn't a habit humans grew out of once fire and shelter stopped being the main priority. Ancient Egyptian records describe elaborate bathing rituals, scented oils, and early cosmetics used across a wide range of social classes, not just royalty. Ancient Mesopotamian texts, among the oldest written documents in existence, include recipes for perfumed oils and cosmetic preparations. Whatever instinct first drove someone to rub crushed aromatic plants onto their skin in deep prehistory didn't disappear once civilizations with writing showed up. It got more elaborate, more documented, and more socially formalized, but the underlying behavior traces back to exactly the same impulse this video has been describing the entire time. There's even a theory connecting all this to why humans lost most of their body hair in the first place, a genuinely distinctive trait among primates. One leading hypothesis argues that reduced body hair helped limit the environment where odor-producing bacteria and parasites could thrive, alongside its more commonly cited role in regulating body temperature during long-distance movement in hot climates. If that theory holds up, managing body odor may have been shaping human evolution at a biological level, long before anyone was consciously grooming themselves with ochre or aromatic plants at all. It's worth being clear about how solid this particular theory actually is. Body hair loss in humans remains genuinely debated among researchers, and multiple competing explanations exist alongside the odor and parasite hypothesis, including thermoregulation during persistence hunting and reduced susceptibility to certain skin conditions. What makes the odor-related version worth including here isn't that it's proven beyond doubt. It's that it fits neatly into the broader pattern this entire video keeps circling back to, a species that appears to have been managing body odor, one way or another, for a very, very long time, long before any of the tools we now associate with hygiene existed. There's a genuinely fascinating comparison worth making here between our own species and Neanderthals, who overlapped with modern humans in Europe and Western Asia for tens of thousands of years. Neanderthals retained noticeably more body hair than modern Homo sapiens throughout that entire overlap period, based on genetic and morphological evidence, which raises an interesting question researchers have actually explored. Did that difference in body hair correspond to a difference in body odor between the two species? And if so, did it matter at all when the two groups encountered each other, which we know happened often enough to leave detectable Neanderthal DNA in most non-African humans today? Nobody can directly test this, obviously. Smell doesn't fossilize. But it's a genuinely interesting thought experiment because it reframes something that usually gets treated as a purely cosmetic difference, body hair, as something that might have carried real biological and even social consequences between two closely related, competing human species sharing the same landscape for an enormous stretch of time. Whether body odor played any role at all in why modern humans eventually outcompeted Neanderthals across Europe remains firmly in the realm of speculation, but it's the kind of small, overlooked variable that serious researchers genuinely do consider when trying to explain competitive advantages between closely related species sharing the same resources and territory. Parasites deserve their own mention here too, because they're directly tied to both the hair loss theory and to how ancient humans actually experienced their own bodies day to day. Reduced body hair genuinely does limit the habitat available to certain skin parasites, lice being the most obvious example, since lice specifically need hair to grip onto and lay eggs in. Archaeological and genetic evidence for human lice actually offers an unexpected window into this story. Genetic studies comparing head lice and body lice, which adapted separately to live in human hair versus clothing fibers, suggest that clothing itself is old enough to have allowed body lice to evolve as a distinct population, giving researchers an indirect but genuinely clever way to estimate roughly how long humans have been wearing clothes at all. Tens of thousands of years, layered directly on top of the timeline for body hair loss. So if you traveled back and stood next to one of them, right next to an average person living tens of thousands of years ago, going about an entirely ordinary day, the honest answer is probably more nuanced than either extreme people tend to imagine. Not perfumed, not clinically clean by modern standards, but very likely not the overwhelming, cartoonish stench that pop culture tends to assign to cavemen either. Something closer to what a modern person might notice after a long day outdoors without deodorant. Noticeable, human, but far from unbearable. It's worth sitting with how much of this entire question turns out to be about expectation rather than biology. The same sweat glands, the same bacteria, the same basic chemistry has been sitting on human skin for hundreds of thousands of years, largely unchanged. What actually shifted, dramatically, is the environment around that biology: diet, clothing fibers, bathing frequency, and eventually an entire industry built around convincing modern humans that their natural, unaltered smell was a problem requiring a product to solve. Ancient humans lived their entire lives without ever being told their smell was wrong, because there was no competing standard yet to measure it against. That last point deserves a closer look, because it's not just a rhetorical flourish. The modern deodorant and antiperspirant industry, worth tens of billions of dollars globally, only really took off in the 20th century, driven substantially by targeted advertising campaigns explicitly designed to convince people that their natural body odor was socially unacceptable. A message that required decades of sustained marketing to actually take hold as common sense. Before that advertising push, natural body odor within a reasonable range was simply an accepted, unremarkable part of being human, much closer to how ancient humans would have experienced it than how most modern people experience their own bodies today. Somewhere between rubbing crushed aromatic leaves on your skin because you like how it smells, and building a global industry around convincing people their default smell is fundamentally wrong, something shifted from personal preference into manufactured insecurity. The nose that would be most offended by all of this, in the end, is a modern one, trained by a century of soap, deodorant, and artificial fragrance to expect a baseline of scentlessness that simply never existed for most of human history. Ancient humans weren't failing some hygiene standard we've since figured out. They were living inside a completely different relationship with their own bodies, one that modern humans, ironically, spent enormous effort and no small amount of aerosol trying to escape.